Hello chess friends, this is Master Valeri Lilov, and in my lecture today I would like to start a new series on lectures about the Masterful Endgames and some of the most important positions that we have to know in order to play the endgames in a successful way. So in that first lecture I have prepared a very instructive endgame position that was played by one of the great endgame masters, Raul Capablanca, the third world champion. So I want to teach you today how to think in the endgames with schemes. Now you have to know that basically every time when we transfer in an endgame, it means when the queens are exchanged, sometimes actually one side gets an advantage. So for instance, one side gets a kind of better structure, or probably it gets some material. So sometimes it happens like that. Of course, there are some equal endgames, but we should know that in the endgame, on the first place, we have to decide what kind of plan to choose. So the technique, as we called it, is on the first place in endgames. So when we get to an endgame, the first thing that we should actually make is to redirect our thought. So it's kind of misconception that many players do, that they think about tactics and they continue to follow their middle game plan, and this is not really what should happen. So what we need to do is, once the queens get exchanged and we have totally different position on the board, to change our plans, to change our ideas, which will be for that position. So we have to carefully stop thinking with variations and literally begin thinking on what kind of goal we have to set in that endgame. What do we want to achieve over there? So definitely we have to leave such kind of useless things about combinations, direct threats like attacks against the king, etc. So in most of the tasks we need to create a plan. So there is a very big difference between the endgame plan and the middle game plan. So the endgame plan is very different because there everything goes a little bit more quiet than in the middle game. So in most of the endgames, actually it goes very quiet, but you have to know that it's decisive what kind of plan you will create. For example, in the middle game, even if you do a mistake in your plan, you can easily repair it by going back and definitely then trying to complicate matters somehow. And in the endgame, possibility for complications is almost known. So that's why we have to begin, first of all, by considering what the opponent wants to do. So this is quite important to know, because when we start thinking what the opponent wants to do, then when we actually start planning what kind of idea to use what kind of scheme to use in that current endgame, we have in mind what the opponent is going to do, and then eventually benefit from that. So in the following position which we have, actually that was played between Capablanca and Grandmaster Ragozin in Moscow, 1936. White has, as you can see, a pawn, an extra pawn, and eventually that pawn is a passed one. So the a3 pawn is a passed pawn. There is no pawn for black on a or the b file, so that it can stop it for it moving forward. But the only problem actually is that white cannot advance that pawn so easy. So if he tries something like rook a1 in order to advance that pawn a4, black can even continue in this position with c5, and the question will be that, okay, white to advance it, but black can even block it, and then he can go with the bishop on d7 or b3, and he will directly attack on it, after which white will experience a lot of problems. So he will not only be unable to advance it forward, but he will also experience problems, because his pawns will be on light squares, so black will easily be able to attack on them. So that's bad, and in fact, if we just begin, as I began, to think with variations, we will come up with nothing. So what we have to do is to formulate a plan, and exactly to formulate this scheme based on the ideas that we want to make. So what is the idea? The idea is to advance the a pawn, but why it doesn't work right now? It doesn't work so much because we don't have the actions of our pieces coordinated onto the proceeding of that goal. So what we need to do in such endgames is actually to formulate where our pieces should go, and definitely to think about their coordination. Every time when we are intending to make a successful plan in the endgame, we have to consider two things. The first one is the activity of each piece, so how active it will be, e.g. how many squares to control, and the other thing is how this piece will contribute to our major plan, so how it will coordinate its actions with the other pieces, and it will basically help to our major plan. So Capablanca actually fought in a very interesting way for this position. So here is what he suggested as a plan for white. So his plan should actually be mainly concerned to keep the black rook on a7 very passive as it is right now. So if black manages to push his c7 pawn forward, eventually that rook will become more active, and he will get some counterplay because he will bring it to b7, then b4 is not going to be possible, etc. So we have to keep that rook there. But how to do it? Well, we can easily do it if we just imagine where our pieces can go. So for example, here is a scheme. We can eventually think about bringing the rook up to c3. Then eventually the king has to go to e3 by, for example, pushing the pawn up to f4. And then, literally, we will put the knight on d4. So when we have such kind of centralized position of our king and the knight, then we can proceed with rook c3, pawn up to b4, and little by little advance our plan on the queen side. So this was the Capablanca's plan, and as you can see, the variations were not really important for him. What was really important for Capablanca was how he will actually achieve that final position, which he has already considered in mind. So once the scheme is actually made, and the scheme is based upon what our goal is and where do we want to go with our piece in order to achieve that goal, the only thing that remains is to put it together with the opponent's ideas and plan and try to find the most critical and, of course, best way for us to achieve this plan in the shortest time possible. So Capablanca started with the most important move, to centralize the knight. Each piece that is put in center, even in endgames, plays a very significant role. The move was knight f3 to d4. Now, of course, black tried to activate his rook, putting a threat on the b2 pawn, but white simply continued with b4. Now, he has the connection between the two pawns on a3 and b4. Now black played bishop back to d7. Now that's a kind of useful move, because when the bishop is put there, for some moment it would take away the resources of the white knight to go forward, so it's good. White played in that position to move f4. And we see that already white is beginning to process his plan. Now he put the knight on d4, he opened the way for the king to go to e3, and he even advanced his b2 pawn up to b4. So little by little, with very small but really purposeful moves, white is very quickly advancing his plan, and in the same time, it's all secure. White is keeping the better activity than black, and definitely his rook on b7 cannot play any role at all. Now black played king to e7, white played king to f2, and black decided to play rook a7. He's trying actually to activate his rook, but that's not so successful actually, simply because after rook a7, white can proceed with rook c3, defending on that a3 pawn. And the question here is that literally black cannot do anything because of one reason. His major piece, which is in the endgame, and that is the rook, is playing no role at all. Now remember that the endgames arise always when the queens exchange. Basically, there is a second type of endgame positions when there are queens, but there are just few pieces, like queens endgames as we call them. But it happens frequently when there's only one queen and just a couple of pawns, etc. So in most of the times, the endgame position can appear with many pieces even when the queens get exchanged. So when the queens get exchanged, the most important pieces that actually remain are the rooks, which of course are second in command after the queens, and when the queens are gone, the rooks are replacing them, and something very important, the kings. So basically the king, after the exchange of queens, the king becomes a very important piece, and the chess players equalize the power, the strength of the king in endgames to 5 pawns, the same as the rook is. So why is that 5 pawns? Very importantly, we can say that 5 pawns is equal to the king, simply because of the fact that the king can easily go forward. It can be centralized, and because the opponent doesn't have a queen with which he can make some threats and checkmate ideas, then that king is actively turning to be one of the most important pieces for the successful plan and any kind of play that we want to proceed with. So white played rook to c3 in this position. Black decided to play king d6, trying to activate his king, but of course white is not only thinking for how to advance his own plan, but he's also thinking on how to prevent the opponent's one. So after king d6, white simply went with the move of rook c3 to d3. Now we see that there is this a threat of uncovered check against the black king, and he has to go backwards. After king e7, of course, white simply advances his own king, and we see how all of white's pieces really contribute their actions on each other. So after king to e3, black played rook a4. I don't really think that this was a quite sensible move, but probably black played it because he doesn't have anything much better. And white played rook to c3, attacking directly in the c7 pawn. Now already white achieved his final position, which he set still in the beginning in his mind. So the scheme is already fulfilled. What to do when already the scheme is fulfilled? Well, it's quite simple. Once the scheme is being fulfilled, what we need to do is to set up a new scheme, a new, even bigger goal for that endgame. So right now, what white would like to do is to, of course, make the most important thing. In the endgame, this is to create a pass pawn. So in the queen side, he has the one more pawn. So he has to use that extra pawn in order to advance it forward and definitely achieve even a bigger advantage by doing it. So how to prepare the advancing of that pawn? Well, it's quite easy. We have to take our king towards the rook and then eventually to make it go away. King d6 was met by rook d3. The black king has to go backwards, and now white decided to play rook c3, like trying to repeat the moves a couple of times. So why is he doing it actually? And here is a really very important thing that you have to know. When you are playing an endgame and you have a better position, think if your opponent doesn't have a chance to create a counterplay. If you see that he's staying and he doesn't have a concrete counterplay that he can try to promote and definitely make his position better, don't hurry in this way. If you try to hurry, you may miss something, and of course we're all human, so mistakes can always happen. So in order to avoid mistakes, we have to go slowly. Not to stop from going forward and play passively, but go slowly. The rule of not to hurry is pretty amazing, and it's working any time when the opponent cannot do anything. So it has been used by many masters of the endgame, and if you look at the games of Capablanca, Grandmaster Floor, and many others, you will see how very slowly they are proceeding and trying to realize their advantage, and in fact managing to deal with any resource that the opponent will try to get in order to complicate matters. So right now what he's doing is that he wants to repeat the moves, simply because first he will win some time to again spend some thinking what the opponent will do if the white king proceeds to the rook. And in the second place, he's actually managing to get a psychological advantage to the opponent. So the defending side, which is in a worse position, frequently is not getting that really great possibility to hold and only to defend. So frequently we don't even need to go and try to make some weakness of the opponent. He's making them on his own, just because he's trying to change the position. He's trying to achieve something new. And we just have no weaknesses in this case. We have not forced the events on our own, and we can simply use what the opponent's weaknesses will be when he tries to complicate matters in a kind of unprepared position. So that's why I'm advising you. When you have the advantage and you don't see how your opponent can get out of that position, repeat the moves. Try to go slowly. That way you will actually burn him on a slow fire, as we called it, and definitely you won't let him to find some counter chances so easy. So white played rook to c3, black advanced the king into d6, and of course white continued with the slow maneuvers, knight to e2. Now of course the knight goes there in order to provide a safe spot of the king in the center. White played rook to d3 check in this case. Black decided to bring his king to e6, and of course white then simply put his own king onto d4, a central strong spot. And now the plan is simple. Of course, white simply wants to go with his king onto c3 and then eventually to go on d3, so everything goes right for white. So there is the move of king d4. Black played rook to a6, and of course white simply gave a check from e3. Now black decided to bring his king on d6 and to try to oppose against the white king, but it's not so easy. In fact, already white is having a really great coordination between all of his pieces. Not some of them, but all of them. And then he played the move of knight to c3. Now as you can see, basically the rook cannot take on a3 actually, simply because of one reason. If he takes on a3, there will be knight e4 check, and black loses his rook right away. So after the move of knight to c3, what happens is that black is having no other choice but to play f5 to take away e4 from the white knight, and then of course white decided to push b5. So white is beginning to advance his pawns on the queen side, and it's really difficult for black to keep them there. So white is simply advancing. Now of course the a3 pawn is still untouchable because of knight e4 check, and he has to bring the rook backwards. So he played rook e8, and now white simply gets the king closer to the pawns in order to provide its safe for advancing. So after king to c4, bishop to e6 check, white played king to b4, and black decided to play c5 check and try to put some difficulties, but I would say that it's already a desperate choice. In fact, even if black did not go with this one, white would have played a4 up to a5 to a6, then knight a4 to c5, and it goes wrong for black actually. This advanced pawn, a passed pawn, will definitely keep the rook to protect it, and then white will be able to play with three pieces like the king, the knight, and the rook against only the bishop, which will be able to protect. And of course white can even advance with king a5, b6 at the right time, and that pawn on a6 will be of course decisive for the fate of the game. So after king b4, black played c5 check, and of course white simply recaptured the pawn. Now it's pretty clear actually. Black is trying to achieve some activity for his pieces, but it's not so easy. After bishop g8, white simply gave a check from b5, and after the move of king takes to c6, white played the move of rook d3. Already the rook wants to go on d6 with a check, then to collect the black pawns from the king's side, and it's not so easy for black to defend. In fact, even in this position, white can decide not to push his a-pawn. In general, black made a mistake still in the beginning. He advanced his pawns on the king's side with f5, and he was using a g6. So those pawns are becoming an object to attack. So here is a principle that you can follow. Always when you're playing an endgame, don't try to push your pawns on some flank of the board without a reason. Simply because if you push them there, you are getting to have those pawns not really useful, and in the same time at some later stage your opponent can attack these pawns. So don't make useless advancing moves with your pawns on some flank of the board where you don't intend to play. So rook d3 followed. Now the threat is rook d6 check. Of course if black plays bishop d5, we can simply take on it. So the question is that we have a check, and then the rook on a8 will be lost. And of course after g5, white simply continued with rook d6 check, king b7, and now the simple exchange. F takes to g5, h takes to g5, and rook to g6 is really very important for white. He's simply threatening the pawn on g5, and the problem is that black cannot even push it forward. White is going to exchange and win that pawn. It's all pretty clear now for white, so he won in just a couple of moves. Rook f8, rook takes to g5, collecting another pawn, so he has now two more. And so with those two extra pawns, it's quite easy to win. f4, and the last chance. A very important move to keep away all the prospects for the opponent to achieve some counterplay. No chances for black will be now with f3, because now the d4 knight actually takes away that spot. So black tried to play rook c8 and threat rook c4 check, but it's not something significant. Rook g7 check followed. King b6, rook to g6 check, like transferring the rook on the powerful 6th rank, and when black played the move of king b7, white can even continue with knight b5, already advancing his pieces in order to put some direct threats against the black king. He used now the move of rook c to f8 just to try and defend the f4 pawn, but it's not really something significant. In fact, that f4 pawn is not relevant for white so much. He has already enough good amount. He played knight d6 check. Of course, it will be a very bad idea for black to step on the 6th rank because the white rook is there and the knight will just uncover a check. So after knight d6 check and king b8, white played the move of h4 and black simply resigned. Why did he resign? Well, white's plan is simple. He's advancing the h pawn is because he has the coordination between his rook and the knight. There is absolutely no way for black to prevent its movement forward and in general to save the game. In my opinion, this is one of the most instructive examples of scheme thinking. So we can see that still in the beginning, Capablanca was not really caring for the variations and what kind of tactical resources we have. No, what he wanted to see is what are the prospects for the opponent to activate his pieces and achieve some counterplay. So then he found the only way to prevent the opponent's chances to achieve a counterplay, and in the same time to contribute this to his own plan and the scheme how to bring the pieces forward. So once the scheme was followed, eventually he improved his position and totally increased his advantage. Then, when the scheme was fulfilled, he found a new scheme how he can expand that current advantage. And simply by improving and expanding the advantage, the opponent's position was totally crushed. And of course, white won successfully. So these are some of the basic and most important things that you can know about the practical chess endgames. This was FIDE Master Valeri Lilov. Thank you, and we'll see you in our next lecture on the Masterful Endgames. Thank you.